The town square buzzed with the restless hum of a crowd, men shouting, booths scuffing, the dry wind carrying grit across the wooden boards. The auction platform stood in the center like a gallows, raised high enough that everyone could see what was being offered. It wasn't cattle today. It wasn't horses or wagons or barrels of grain. It was her. Mary stood there, the sun beating down on her shoulders, her throat dry from the heat and from holding back tears. She was only 17, barely grown into her womanhood, and yet her fate had been decided for her. Her kin stood behind her, faces hard as stone, arms crossed as though to say they had done their duty and would not think of it again. She wanted to scream, to beg, to run. But her legs were rooted, her hands clutching the hem of her faded cotton dress until her knuckles ached. The auctioneer barked like a showman, his voice rough from years of shouting livestock prices. 17 years old, strong, can cook, clean, tend animals. You won't find better for a homestead wife. His words rolled over her like blows, each one stripping away her dignity. He lifted her chin roughly so the men could see her face, and laughter rippled through the crowd, low, cruel, mocking. Who'll start the bidding? $2, someone called, laughter following. A bottle of whiskey, another shouted. Mary's cheeks burned. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and shame washed over her like a tide. She had always been poor, had always worked hard, but never had she felt so much like a thing, like a mule or a piece of old furniture. She dropped her eyes, staring at the dusty boards beneath her feet, willing herself not to cry. The auctioneer frowned. Come on, gents, she's strong, she's young, she'll make a fine wife. Don't waste my time. The bids went on, careless and mocking. Her kin didn't move. Her father's jaw was set, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. To him, this was survival, nothing more. A mouth less to feed, a coin in his pocket. And then the crowd fell quiet. The sound of boots on the boards, slow and heavy, cut through the jeers. A man stepped forward, taller than most, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding without a word. His hair was dark streaked with gray, his beard trimmed close, his skin weathered by sun and wind. He looked older, twice her age, perhaps more, but his eyes, when they lifted to her, were not cruel. They were steady, piercing, and tired, as though he carried burdens she could not see. $50, he said. His voice was deep, calm, like the rumble of thunder before rain. The crowd muttered. 50 was far more than any man had offered, far more than anyone expected. It silenced the laughter. Even the auctioneer blinked, surprised, before slamming the gavel down. Sold. To Mr. Caleb Harlow. Mary's knees almost buckled as her kin shoved her forward, her small satchel of belongings thrust into her hands. She stumbled down the steps and found herself standing before the man who now owned her. She braced herself for roughness, for the grip of a hand dragging her away. But he only tipped his hat slightly and said, in a voice quieter than the crowd, "You'll ride with me." She climbed into the wagon, heart hammering, sitting stiff as a fence post. The horses pulled them away from town, the noise fading into the distance. The road stretched wide and empty, lined with dry grass and broken fences. She kept her eyes fixed on her lap, afraid to look at him, afraid to imagine what would happen when they reached his ranch. Caleb Harlow drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins. He did not speak, did not try to touch her, did not even glance her way. The quiet pressed on her, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to ask why $50? Why her? But the words lodged in her throat. When the ranch finally came into view, she lifted her eyes. It was vast and lonely, fields rolling out to the horizon, fences sagging in places, a barn leaning tiredly, and a weather-beaten house that stood sturdy despite the years. There was no laughter, no voices, no family waiting. Only the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. He pulled the horses to a stop, climbed down, and came around to help her. She flinched when he reached for her satchel, but he only carried it inside the house. The air smelled of wood smoke and leather, the walls bare except for a few shelves and a rifle hung neatly above the hearth. He set the bag down in a small room with a narrow bed and a quilt folded at its foot. "This is yours," he said, his voice low and even. "Until you're ready." Her breath caught. She looked up at him, startled, searching his face for cruelty or mockery. But there was none. He nodded once, stepped back, and left her standing there. The door clicked shut behind him. Mary sank onto the bed, clutching the quilt in her hands. For the first time since morning, she let the tears fall. She was 17, sold like cattle, bound to a man twice her age. She was supposed to belong to him in every way, yet he had given her a room of her own, spoken to her gently, and left her alone. She wiped her cheeks, confused and trembling. She didn't understand him, she didn't know what would come tomorrow, or the day after, but one thought whispered through her fear: maybe she was not as lost as she thought. The prairie wind howled outside the window, rattling the shutters, carrying with it a sense of change she could not yet name. Somewhere deep inside, a fragile thread of hope began to stir. The days at Caleb Harlow's ranch passed in a quiet rhythm, different from anything Mary had ever known. At first, she moved through them like a ghost, unsure where she belonged, waiting for the moment when the kindness she thought she saw in him would turn to harshness. She woke at dawn, helped with the cooking, scrubbed what needed scrubbing, and tried to make herself small, unnoticed. But Caleb wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He worked long hours outside, repairing fences, tending cattle, hauling feed, riding the boundaries of his land. He rose before sunrise and returned only when the sky flamed orange, dust covering his boots and sweat soaking his shirt. And each evening, without fail, he washed up, sat at the table across from her, and ate whatever she had made with a quiet, "Thank you, Mary." No more, no less. That first week, she found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. He carried himself with the weariness of someone who had seen more than he cared to speak of. His hands were large, scarred, not rough in movement but steady. His eyes, though lined at the corners, never hardened when they looked her way. He spoke little, but she came to learn that his silence wasn't coldness. It was simply who he was. She began to relax, piece by piece, as the days slipped into weeks. When she dropped a plate in the kitchen and it shattered on the floor, she had braced for shouting. But Caleb only bent down, picked up the larger shards, and told her to mind her fingers. When she burnt the cornbread one evening, she flushed with shame, expecting anger. But he ate it anyway, saying nothing, just chewing slowly before giving a small nod. It unsettled her, this quiet patience. She had been bracing herself for ownership, for being used, for her body to be taken as part of the price he had paid. Yet Caleb never crossed that line. He gave her space, a room of her own, and time. At night, she lay awake in the little bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man paid $50 for a bride and then kept his distance. The answer began to reveal itself one late evening, when a storm rolled over the prairie. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and lightning split the sky. Mary stood in the kitchen, clutching the lantern, when the front door banged open. Caleb strode in, drenched to the bone, carrying a half-dead calf in his arms. He set it by the fire, kneeling beside it, his shirt clinging to his back. She hurried to fetch blankets, instinct moving her before fear could. Together, they rubbed warmth back into the animal, their hands brushing as they worked. The calf stirred at last, a weak cry rising from its throat. Caleb let out a breath, and when his eyes met Mary's, she saw something she hadn't before. A softness, a gratitude, and something deeper, something like recognition. For the first time, his hand lingered, not on her, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. From that night, things shifted. Mary began to laugh again, quiet at first, when one of the barn cats chased its own tail, or when Caleb muttered at a stubborn fence post. He noticed, though he didn't always show it. Sometimes, she caught the faintest twitch of a smile tugging at his beard. She found herself humming while she cooked, and once, without thinking, she left the door to her room ajar. Then came the evening he came in late, shoulders slumped more heavily than usual. She had kept supper warm for him, stew bubbling on the stove. When he sat down, she poured him a bowl, set it in front of him, and instead of retreating to her own chair, she sat beside him. Close enough that their elbows brushed. He froze for a moment, spoon halfway to his lips, before lowering it and glancing at her. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I want to," she whispered back, surprising herself with the boldness. Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but undeniable. That night, for the first time, Caleb didn't stop at her door. He paused, hesitated, and she met him there, her hands trembling but not from fear. She looked up at him, searching his face. He didn't move until she gave the smallest nod, and then he stepped inside. It was not rough, not hurried, not like the ugly stories she had been told. He was gentle, careful as though she were glass. His hands shook as much as hers, and when it was done, he held her close, whispering nothing but her name. She cried into his chest, not from pain, but from relief, relief that love, true love, could feel like safety. The weeks after that wove them together tighter than she thought possible. She learned his habits, his silences, the rare way his eyes lit when she teased him. He learned her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she hummed while kneading dough. They worked side by side, patched the ranch together, and filled the lonely house with something new. And then one morning, as the sun rose pink over the horizon, Mary stood on the porch, her hand pressed to her belly. Caleb came up behind her, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, and though her voice was barely a whisper, it carried in the quiet air. "Caleb, I think I'm with child." He went still, his breath catching, before he turned her toward him. His hands cupped her face, rough thumbs brushing away the tears already slipping down her cheeks. He didn't speak, only kissed her, soft, reverent, sealing her fear away with a promise. For Mary, who had been sold like livestock at 17, who had thought her life would end before it ever began, that moment was the first time she truly understood. She hadn't been bought, she had been found, and in Caleb's arms, she knew she would never again be alone.